Millionaire's autistic son was born paralyzed until the maid did the impossible. Edward Hale had once been a legendary name in the world of architecture. He was the man behind towering skyscrapers that lit up the city, celebrated in newspapers, and featured in prestigious magazines. But all that glory had faded. At 45, Edward no longer appeared in interviews, no longer attended ceremonies of honor. He had withdrawn from the outside world, living quietly in a massive mansion on the outskirts, a place where everything was perfect yet missing the most important thing: life. The mansion, though majestic with its white marble walls and tall windows pouring in sunlight, felt lifeless. Footsteps echoed endlessly through the long halls, but no laughter followed. Silence reigned, so heavy it seemed to freeze time itself. Edward once had a happy family, but the wife he loved most had passed away after a long illness, leaving him alone with their only son, Lucas. The boy was just 7 years old, his eyes clear yet distant. Lucas had been diagnosed with autism early in life, along with partial paralysis that confined him to a wheelchair. He never spoke a word, never responded to a gaze, never showed emotion. Since his wife's death, Edward had devoted every ounce of energy to helping his son. He brought in top doctors, paid for expensive therapy programs, and bought every kind of supportive device. He tried music, pictures, sign language, even therapy animals. But every effort ended the same way, in silence. Lucas sat there, eyes far away, as if cut off from the world. Each morning, Edward prepared breakfast himself. He trusted no one else with the task. Father and son sat at the long dining table, Edward telling small stories, asking questions, even smiling gently, hoping for some response. But Lucas never looked into his eyes. The faint clinking of a spoon against a bowl often became the only sound in the vast room. After breakfast, Edward pushed Lucas into the therapy room he had built. It was bright and colorful, filled with toys and modern equipment. Teams of specialists came and went, each trying a new method. The result was always the same: silence. Sometimes Lucas twitched his fingers or tilted his head slightly, but there was never a word, a smile, or a clear glance. Edward had once been a strong, decisive man, accustomed to controlling every situation. In business, he could read numbers with ease, close deals, and achieve success. But when faced with his own son, he was powerless. He couldn't buy a glance, couldn't earn a single word from Lucas. The silence stood as a towering wall between them. Night after night, Edward lay awake, staring at the ceiling while the baby monitor beside him carried faint sounds from Lucas's room. He worried constantly about the future. When he was gone, who would care for Lucas? Who would understand his silence? The question circled endlessly, weighing heavily on his heart. Still, every morning, Edward rose early, walked to the kitchen, prepared breakfast, and followed the same familiar routine. He never gave up, because no matter how silent the world remained, Lucas was his son, the most precious part of his life. Life in the mansion moved quietly until the day Grace Miller arrived. Grace was 28, her face gentle, but her eyes shadowed by sorrow. Not long ago, she had endured the greatest loss of her life, the sudden death of her beloved younger brother. The accident came without warning, without a chance for goodbye. Since that day, Grace had been adrift, trapped in the weight of endless days. Friends and relatives avoided the subject while she tried to appear strong. But inside, her heart was fractured. One afternoon, she stumbled upon a job posting for a full-time housemaid at the Hale Mansion. It wasn't glamorous, nor was it prestigious. Yet Grace thought perhaps it could be a way to start over. A stable job, a new routine, and more importantly, a place quiet enough for her to breathe after suffocating in grief. On her first day, she boarded an old bus, carrying a small bag with a few clothes and treasured keepsakes. As the bus turned down a tree-lined road, the mansion appeared, grand, imposing, yet cold. The iron gates opened, and she stepped into another world. Edward Hale himself greeted her at the door. Tall, neatly dressed, his voice was clear but distant. He gave a brief explanation of her duties, the household schedule, and then paused when mentioning Lucas. "My son is special. He needs absolute quiet," Edward said, his tone dropping. Grace only nodded softly, asking nothing more. Inside, the house gleamed, every corner immaculate, everything perfectly in place. Yet the atmosphere was strikingly different. It was eerily silent, as if life had been drained away. Grace noticed small details. A corner filled with toys covered in dust, a shelf lined with children's books untouched. Everything carried a quiet sadness. Then Grace saw Lucas for the first time. The boy sat in his wheelchair, his gaze unfocused. Soft hair fell across his forehead, his small hands resting still on his lap. No sound, no reaction. Grace didn't speak. She simply nodded to Edward and began her work. Inside, she felt a strange calm. There was no fear, no pity, only a sense that she was in the right place, though she couldn't yet explain why. What struck Edward immediately was how Grace treated Lucas. Previous staff had either tried too hard to make him laugh or gave up quickly when he didn't respond. Grace was different. She didn't force a smile or pressure him. She simply existed, cleaning quietly, moving gently, making no sudden noises, sometimes just sitting in his room doing nothing at all. Her presence brought neither noise nor pressure. It was simply presence. Edward observed from a distance, and it surprised him. In a house long filled with tension, this was the first time someone had chosen silence, chosen acceptance. In those first days, Grace didn't try to figure out Lucas. She didn't need instructions or theories. Instead, she slipped naturally into the rhythm of the household without disturbing it. Though no obvious changes had occurred yet, Edward sensed a shift. The house felt lighter, less strained, and within him a small spark of hope, long extinguished, began to flicker again. The following days, Grace grew accustomed to the rhythm of life inside the mansion. Everything moved slowly, almost monotonously. Silent meals, therapy sessions ending in disappointment, long evenings filled only with the sound of wind through tall windows. Yet within that stillness, Grace began to notice details others had overlooked. She often cleaned in the same room as Lucas. She didn't try to start conversations or prompt him for reactions. She simply worked, dusting tables, folding blankets, arranging books. But when she looked up, she noticed Lucas's eyes shift slightly, as though he was aware of her presence. At other times, when she pulled the curtains aside and the fabric rustled, Lucas's small hand twitched. They were tiny changes, but Grace paid attention. One rainy afternoon, Grace was mopping the floor when she heard raindrops pattering against the glass. In that moment, she saw Lucas tilt his head, his gaze turning toward the window. It wasn't the vacant stare he usually wore. It was as if he was listening. Grace quietly opened the window a crack, letting in the damp air and sound of rain. Lucas said nothing, but his fingers curled gently, a clear reaction. To Grace, it was the first undeniable sign. Lucas wasn't unfeeling. He simply responded in his own way. In the days that followed, Grace began small experiments. When washing her hands at the sink, she turned the faucet slowly, letting the trickle of water fill the room. Each time, Lucas's fingers moved, and his eyes seemed a little brighter. She never mentioned it to anyone. She simply remembered. To her, these moments were more valuable than any therapy session. Edward noticed the difference too, though he didn't speak of it. Sitting quietly at the edge of each therapy session, he watched his son, and occasionally he watched Grace. Perhaps he wasn't ready to believe in anything concrete, but curiosity stirred within him. He didn't understand why, but something shifted when Grace was near. What impressed him most was her patience. Others grew restless, eager for quick results. Grace never did. She didn't expect Lucas to smile or speak right away. She was simply there, gentle, unhurried, without demands. That steady presence slowly lifted the weight that had long pressed down on the house. One afternoon, Grace folded laundry in the living room where Lucas sat in his wheelchair. She hummed softly, a tune without words. Suddenly, she caught a glimpse of Lucas turning his head slightly toward her. Just a small movement, but unmistakable. Grace pretended not to notice, continuing her folding. Inside, warmth spread quietly through her chest. That night, Edward entered the kitchen where Grace was washing dishes. He stood silently for a while before asking unexpectedly, "Have you noticed anything different about him?" Grace looked up, surprised but calm. After a pause, she replied, "I think Lucas listens more than we realize. He just isn't ready to answer yet." Edward said nothing, but in his eyes flickered a mix of confusion and hope. One afternoon, as the last sunlight streamed through the tall windows, Grace pushed Lucas's wheelchair into the garden. The garden was wide, with neatly trimmed grass, tall trees, and at the end of the stone path lay a clear blue pool. Since her arrival, Grace had noticed the pool but had never taken Lucas near it. That day, for reasons she couldn't explain, she turned toward it. Lucas sat still, his eyes distant as always. But as they approached the pool, Grace noticed a shift in his body. His shoulders relaxed, his fingers twitched, and his gaze seemed just a little more focused. She stopped, wheeled him to the water's edge, and sat down beside him. The surface shimmered in the sunlight, ripples reflecting a gentle blue. Lucas stared at the pool. It wasn't the vacant stare of usual days. It was true attention. Grace leaned down, dipping her hand into the water, gently splashing. The sound echoed, soft, rhythmic. Instantly, Lucas turned his head faster than ever before. His eyes followed the movement, his hand jerking slightly. Grace said nothing, only continued splashing lightly, as though it were a game. To her surprise, Lucas wasn't afraid or unsettled. Instead, he seemed to listen, and for a fleeting moment, the corners of his lips curved, almost like the shadow of a smile. From a distance, Edward stood by his study window, quietly watching. He was used to failed therapies, endless disappointment, but the sight froze his heart. For the first time in years, his son was reacting clearly. He didn't interfere, only stood there, chest tight with emotion. From that day forward, Grace changed the routine. Each morning after breakfast, before therapy, she wheeled Lucas into the garden and stopped by the pool. She never forced anything. She simply sat with him, letting him watch the water, listen to the breeze. On rainy days, she opened the window so he could hear raindrops hitting the surface. Lucas remained quiet, but his body was looser, no longer stiff. One afternoon, Grace dipped her fingers into the pool and stirred gently. Lucas immediately tilted his head toward her, his eyes sharper than ever. It was a small movement, but enough for Grace to know she had found something that truly reached him. Edward began coming to the garden more often. He didn't intervene, only observed from nearby. He noticed that Lucas no longer turned away when Grace approached, no longer stiffened when she placed something before him. Instead, he seemed to accept her presence, perhaps even anticipate it. One morning, as Grace and Lucas sat by the pool, Edward joined them. He lowered himself onto a bench across from his son, his eyes never leaving the boy. Grace gently tapped the water, droplets glittering in the sun. Lucas followed every ripple, his small hand opening, as though longing to touch. "Do you see it?" Grace whispered, her voice low enough for Edward alone. Edward nodded, his gaze fixed on Lucas. "I see." His voice was thick, strained by the weight of emotion. Mornings by the pool soon became a ritual. The mansion, once heavy with silence, now held a softer space, where the water reflected not just the sky, but hope. Grace remained patient, never expecting miracles overnight. Yet she knew that each small gesture, each focused glance, was a great step forward. And Edward whispered silently to himself that perhaps, after years of searching everywhere, the answer had been here all along, in the sound of water, in the gentle hand of a stranger. Mornings by the pool had become part of their lives. Edward rarely missed them, even if he only stood at a distance. Each day Grace remained patient, sitting beside Lucas, gently stirring the water or simply letting him gaze at it. Gradually, Edward began to notice changes. Lucas's hands grew more responsive, his eyes less vacant, his breathing calmer whenever they were near the pool. One summer afternoon, golden light stretched across the garden. Grace decided to try something new. For days she had debated, should she bring Lucas into the water? The thought filled her with both hope and worry. But seeing his comfort by the pool, she knew the time had come. She prepared a small flotation vest, carefully checking every strap. Edward hesitated, standing at the edge, his brow furrowed. "He's never been in the water," he murmured, almost as a warning. Grace looked up at him, her voice calm, yet firm. "I won't do anything dangerous. I'll hold him the whole time. Just a little try." Edward was silent, then nodded. Not because his fear had vanished, but because there was determination in Grace's eyes that he couldn't deny. Kneeling down, Grace gently slipped the vest onto Lucas. To her surprise, he didn't resist. His body tensed, but he didn't fight. That alone was a small victory. She carried him down the pool steps, whispering softly, "It's okay, Lucas. I'm here. I won't let go." The water rose to his chest. At first, Lucas shivered, his shoulders drawn tight, his fists clenched. Grace held him firmly, keeping him close. "You're safe. You're okay." Her voice was light as the breeze, steady and soothing. Minutes passed, and slowly the tension in his body melted. His hands began to uncurl, fingers brushing the surface. Then, tilting his head back into the gentle cradle of the water, Lucas released a sound Edward thought he would never hear. A laugh. Bright, fragile, but unmistakably real, it broke through years of silence like sunlight piercing a storm. Grace froze, her heart racing. She had waited so long for a strong reaction, but never dared to dream of laughter. Tears filled her eyes as she smiled, still holding him close. At the pool's edge, Edward was paralyzed. His eyes widened, hands gripping the bench. Then he heard it again, a small laugh, real and alive. His heart erupted. Years of silence, shattered by his son's laughter. Edward collapsed to his knees, hands covering his face as tears streamed uncontrollably. He had prepared himself to never hear such a sound. And now, here it was, echoing through the air. Grace continued to hold Lucas, gently moving with him in the water. Lucas was no longer rigid. He relaxed, his hands splashing lightly, a quiet smile on his lips. To Grace, every movement was a miracle. Then came the greatest one. Lucas turned his head, eyes locking onto Edward, for the first time. His lips moved, and a fragile sound slipped out. "Dad!" The world stood still. Edward froze, his heart stopping. He lifted his head, afraid he had imagined it. What did you say?" he whispered, voice trembling. "Dad." The word was soft, trembling, yet clear enough to shatter Edward's years of despair. In that single syllable, the silence of a lifetime collapsed. Edward broke down, tears falling like rain. He reached for the edge, stretching his hand toward his son. In that moment, every pain, every disappointment of the years dissolved. One word, "Dad," had torn down the wall of silence he thought unbreakable. Grace looked at Edward, her eyes glistening. No words were needed. Both understood. This was the turning point. It wasn't just a random sound, but proof that Lucas was ready to open a new door. After that miraculous afternoon by the pool, everything in the mansion seemed different. No one said it aloud, but both Edward and Grace felt it. The wall of silence surrounding Lucas had cracked. And through that crack, light began to pour in. The next day, as usual, Grace brought Lucas to the pool. This time he sat in his vest with sharper focus. Edward no longer stood at a distance. He sat at the edge of the pool. The air was so peaceful that every small sound, the splash of water, the call of birds, felt vivid. Grace gently set a soft plastic ball onto the water. It floated, drifting toward Lucas. Unexpectedly, he reached out, brushing it with his hand. Grace smiled. "Quoi bon?" she whispered warmly. Edward leaned closer, repeating in English, "Ball." Lucas didn't answer, but his lips moved as if trying to repeat. That day, no word came, but they both knew it was the beginning. In the days that followed, Grace brought other toys, little rubber ducks, a few that made cheerful noises, and soap bubbles. She never forced Lucas to play. She simply placed them nearby. Slowly, he began to respond. When a rubber duck floated past, he reached out, holding it still, staring intently. Grace said softly, "Convit," then repeated, "Duck." One afternoon, the unexpected happened. As she spoke the word again, Lucas looked at the toy, his lips moving, and whispered, "Duck." Edward nearly dropped the notebook in his hands. He rushed over, kneeling beside his son. "That's right," he said, his voice breaking. "Duck." Grace remained quiet, her eyes shining with tears she refused to shed. She didn't want to turn the moment into noise. Lucas didn't need applause. He only needed gentle acknowledgement. From then on, their poolside play became the most natural classroom. No boards, no desks, only water, sunlight, and love. Lucas began learning simple words tied to his experiences. Ball, blue, read. Each word was a gift. Edward no longer stayed on the sidelines. He joined in, removing his shoes, sitting at the pool's edge, sometimes dipping his feet in the water. He read books to Lucas, pointing at pictures, emphasizing each word. When Lucas said, "Read," Edward nearly broke down on the spot. Grace continued guiding with gentle steadiness. She never pushed, only created chances. When Lucas stayed silent, she smiled and waited. When he mispronounced, she repeated slowly. And when he succeeded, she simply nodded, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Beyond words, Lucas found another form of expression: art. Grace spread papers and crayons on a large cloth by the pool. At first hesitant, Lucas soon drew shaky lines. Blue appeared most often, the color of water, the pool. He drew circles, waves, sometimes even simple figures. Edward hung some of the drawings in the living room. For the first time, the mansion carried Lucas's imprint, not an empty silence, but his presence made visible. In the afternoons, Grace blew soap bubbles, letting them float in the air. Lucas's eyes lit up, his hand reaching. Each time a bubble popped, he let out a sound resembling laughter. Edward and Grace sat together, speaking no words, simply sharing the joy. Little by little, Lucas built a new language, not only with words, but with eyes, gestures, drawings, and laughter. And along the way, both Edward and Grace learned to listen differently, not only with their ears, but with their hearts. The mansion was no longer a cold, hollow space. It filled with the soft, precious sounds of life, the splash of water, the rustle of paper, as Lucas drew, the bumpy syllables of ball, duck, blue. And most of all, laughter, the very sound Edward once believed he would never hear again. Time passed, and the Hale mansion changed. Once filled only with echoes of wind, it now brimmed with living sounds. Lucas's soft laughter, Grace's quiet singing in the kitchen, Edward's voice reading aloud by the window. The wall of silence that had surrounded the home for years had broken, replaced by warmth. Grace was no longer just the maid in Edward's eyes. He saw how she became part of every moment of Lucas's life. She was patient, gentle, asking for nothing but to be present. Sometimes Edward stood at the doorway, watching her bend over a book with Lucas or guide him through the garden. Those images softened his heart, a feeling he thought long lost. Lucas, too, was different. He wasn't only learning words, he was showing affection. When Grace entered a room, his eyes brightened. When Edward sat beside him, he reached for his father's hand. Small gestures, but for them, undeniable proof that Lucas was opening up. One evening, the three sat together in the living room. Grace spread out paper and crayons on the table. Lucas scribbled eagerly, while Edward read aloud from a children's book. Every so often, Lucas looked up, repeating a word or laughing softly when Edward used a silly voice to mimic a character. That night, the house rang with laughter. Edward sat in silence for a moment, realizing it was the first time in years he hadn't felt alone. After that, Edward changed even more. He began sharing tasks with Grace, preparing breakfast together, teaching Lucas new words side by side. Sometimes they sat on the porch, watching Lucas chase soap bubbles. Edward spoke little, but the look in his eyes toward Grace was no longer cold. It carried trust and gratitude. As for Grace, though she had never imagined staying with a family like this, she felt herself healing. The loss of her brother still lingered, but each time Lucas laughed or whispered a word, her heart seemed to mend piece by piece. One autumn afternoon, Lucas surprised them both. He handed Grace a paper with 3 stick figures, a tall man, a long-haired woman, and a boy in between. Lucas pointed at the tall figure. "Dad!" Then the woman. "Grace." Finally, the boy. "Me?" Grace was speechless, tears spilling down her cheeks. Edward studied the drawing for a long time, then smiled, a rare, heartfelt smile. No words were needed. Lucas had drawn his family. From that day, their bond was no longer just care. It became something deeper, an invisible thread tying them together. They shared meals, cleaned side by side, and laughed at small, simple moments. The cold mansion had truly become a home. Winter arrived softly, covering the Hale garden in a thin veil of mist. The chill didn't stop their morning ritual by the pool, only now Grace and Edward wrapped Lucas in warm coats, sitting under the canopy as they gazed at the still water. For them, the pool had become a symbol, the place where Lucas laughed for the first time, said "Dad" for the first time, and where every step forward began. Lucas was different now. He no longer spoke only single words, but began forming short phrases. One morning, when Grace handed him the ball, he didn't just say ball, but added, "blue ball." The brief sentence left both Edward and Grace speechless. Then Edward burst into laughter, hugging his son tightly, while Grace discreetly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. It wasn't just language. Lucas's emotions were clearer, too. When he enjoyed a game, he clapped softly. When tired, he rested his head on Grace's shoulder. When Edward read stories, he looked up intently, sometimes uttering, "Again." Small gestures, but powerful proof that the boy, once surrounded by silence, now truly sought connection. One weekend, Edward decided to try something new. He took Lucas and Grace to the city library. At first, Lucas was overwhelmed by the vast space and the crowd. His shoulders hunched, fists clenched. Grace bent down at once, whispering, "It's okay, Lucas. I'm here." Edward laid a firm hand on his son's shoulder, his eyes reassuring. Slowly, Lucas relaxed, letting Grace guide him through the aisles. In the children's section, Lucas stopped before a book with a sea blue cover. He pointed at it, eyes shining. Edward took it down and began reading on the spot. For the first time, Lucas uttered 3 words in a row. "Read Blue Book." Both Grace and Edward held their breath. In the hushed library, his voice sounded like music. From that day, the library became their weekly outing. Lucas grew used to choosing books, even handing them to Edward while saying, "Read." Each time, Edward read with all the patience in his heart, while Grace sat nearby, smiling at father and son. After that, they expanded further: small trips to the grocery store, visits to the library, quiet afternoons at a cafe. Each place brought challenges: noise, strangers, new smells. But Grace was always beside him, steady and reassuring. Edward learned to step back, allowing Lucas to experience instead of shielding him too tightly. One day at the library, when another boy handed Lucas a small toy car, Edward tensed, but Lucas looked at the toy, touched it lightly, then turned and whispered, "Thank you." It was the first time he had spoken to someone outside. Grace nearly cried on the spot. Step by step, Lucas was learning not just new words, but how to be among people. He began to smile when greeted, to wave goodbye when leaving. Simple things to most, but monumental milestones for Edward and Grace. One afternoon, the three of them sat outside a small cafe. Gentle sunlight stretched across the street. Lucas watched people pass by, then suddenly turned and said slowly, "Happy here." Edward froze while Grace gripped his hand, her heart overflowing. That short phrase was proof. Lucas was no longer trapped in a closed-off world. He had found joy in being part of life. And for Edward, that moment was worth more than any achievement in his career. Their journey into the world was only beginning, but every small step Lucas took proved something vital. He wasn't just learning to speak, he was learning to live. And most importantly, he wasn't walking that path alone. That spring, the Hale garden bloomed with color. After a long journey, Edward realized that not only had Lucas changed, he himself had too. His heart, once closed by loss and burden, had slowly opened again, thanks to Grace's steady, gentle presence. He often caught himself quietly watching her, the way she bent down to read with Lucas, the small laugh when he pronounced a word correctly, the tender hand soothing him when he was tired. Each detail etched itself into Edward's heart. For the first time in years, the house felt alive, and the light behind it was Grace. One evening, after dinner, Edward led Grace into the garden. Moonlight spread softly across the grass, the pool shimmering silver. He stopped, turned to her, and held out a small box. His voice trembled, but his eyes were steady. "Grace, you came and turned this house into a home, not only for Lucas, but for me. I don't know what life would be without you. Will you marry me?" Grace froze, tears springing instantly, but her smile bloomed. She nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I will." At that moment, Lucas, watching from afar, clapped his hands and let out a bright laugh, as if he understood his father's joy. The wedding was simple but warm, held in the garden that had witnessed so many memories. Only close friends, a few relatives, and genuine laughter filled the day. Lucas wore a small suit, standing proudly beside his father, while Grace, radiant in white, glowed like morning light. When vows were exchanged, Lucas softly said, "Family," and the entire gathering was moved to tears. Life after the wedding flowed peacefully. The Hale mansion was no longer cold, but filled with conversations, music, and children's laughter. Edward and Grace cared for Lucas together, walking every step of his growth. And then unexpected joy arrived. Grace was expecting. 9 months and 10 days later, a baby girl was born. They named her Daisy, hoping she would bring joy like wildflowers, simple yet full of life. Holding his daughter for the first time, Edward couldn't stop the tears. He kissed Grace's forehead and whispered, "Thank you. Because of you, I finally know what complete feels like." Lucas, now able to show affection clearly, welcomed his baby sister with care. He sat by the crib, gently taking Daisy's tiny fingers in his own. "Baby," he said slowly, repeating it again and again as if not to forget. When Daisy cried, Lucas placed a small toy beside her, eyes filled with worry but also love. Grace often stood watching the two of them together, her heart overflowing with joy. Edward could only smile, wrapping his arms around them all. His home, once shadowed by silence, now shone with light. Time passed, and Daisy grew up in the embrace of her family. Lucas was not just a brother, but a patient companion. He learned to read to her, carefully pointing at each picture, just as Grace once had for him. Daisy listened with wide, shining eyes, as if she already knew her brother was extraordinary. One evening, as sunset gilded the garden, the family of 4 sat together by the pool, the place where it had all begun. Daisy nestled in Grace's arms. Lucas sat beside Edward, with his feet dipping into the water. They looked at one another and smiled. They needed no words. In the fading glow of sunset, with Daisy cradled in Grace's arms and Lucas's feet skimming the water beside his father, the truth was undeniable. They had found what Edward once thought impossible: true happiness. Not perfection, but a family. Not grandeur, but a home. And above all, a love that was whole.